Welcome to our session today on Setup for Success, Reviewing Manufacturing Best Practices. And joining us today is John Grant from Innovia Consulting. And we're excited to have such a large turnout today. Before I pass it over to John to cover on this hot topic, I would like to let you know that we are recording this session and it will be available on our on-demand webinar library later this week for you to review and share with anyone. And if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the questions box and we will get them answered during our Q&A time at the end of our session. So now I'll pass it on to John to kick off our presentation.
There we go. And for those of you that haven't met, I've been with Innovia for, I think now it's like over 4,000 days. For those of you, that's over 11 years. Anyway, my background, I've worked on ERP, manufacturing, distribution all my career, and having a chance to be in many companies. Enjoy working with the NAV/BC product. Has a lot of functionality, although I know as my role as an implementer, our goal isn't to implement every piece of software, but to help you succeed with pieces that make sense. And we'll go to the next slide. Just to set the stage, I've got a lot of material. We'll see if we can get through it. And obviously questions are appreciated. So if you hit the next slide, Angie. So today what we're going to talk about is functionality in specific areas of manufacturing. Maybe some of the lessons that I've seen and shared with customers and implementing for a number of years. Obviously, if you have a question, jump in there. Some of the gaps that might make, that I've seen in the different areas, and also looking for input from you. Next slide. So we're going to talk about types of manufacturing, and NAV is pretty versatile. We're going to talk about make-to-stock manufacturers or even distributors, make-to-order/build-to-order, process, assemble, and engineer. So that's kind of how I break apart implementing NAV, and each area has its own unique, and I can say in all the years I've worked with, and not just NAV, but with other ERP products, pretty much no two companies with the same software implement it the same. And that's just understanding what you need and what makes sense for your business. So the first we're going to look at is make to stock. So next slide, we'll look at the make to stock. And my definition of a make to stock profile is typically you're making the stock potentially because your lead times are outside of sales lead times. You may have management who carry some inventory typically. You're fulfilling customer contracts, maybe have seasonal demand, and it's just a business strategy to have on-hand inventory of manufactured parts because that's who you are. Next slide. Some of the functionality that make the stock, and this applies to other areas of course too, but I tried to break it apart. We go back one more, there we go. Utilizing the planning worksheet. We'll talk a little about item planning setups to support the planning worksheet. May use forecasting, we'll touch on that. And flushing methods can be used to help speed up how you get data off the shop floor and how do you push data into cost of goods sold and those kind of things. And again, any questions, certainly jump in there. Next slide, we're going to go through reorder policies. First one I'm going to talk about quickly is fixed reorder. Let's take a look at fixed reorder because there are 5, blank being a valid one. Next slide. So in the fixed reorder, obviously the reorder policy is fixed reorder. Typically you're dealing with a reorder point and a reorder quantity. And then you may also have order multiples. This reorder policy tends to build inventory. You have excess inventory on hand, but for C items, may be perfectly fine. A items, not so much because you'll have more inventory, you're carrying it longer. So fixed reorder, again, is low cost items in my view of what you might use this for. One of the key fields that work well with fixed reorder is the overflow or overflow level, which was introduced probably in 2016 maybe. That was a new field. They used to, that helps, gives us some flexibility. Next slide, we're going to talk about the overflow level on fixed reorder. So this is controlled by you. Basically, as a buyer, I will have the system tell me reorder, but only up to I don't want it to exceed by so much over the reorder point. Applications, this might be storage limitations, might be I'm filling a liquid. I've got a vessel out there that holds like 100,000 gallons, and I only have so much room. And the system out of the box, if you're running a version 2016 or later, I believe, it allows the default calculation as the default in the inventory setup. And I usually recommend, let's not turn that on because it's a new feature. Let's let the user determine if they're going to use that field. And that's where you flip that to use item SKU values only, meaning you are controlling the overflow level, not the system. Because every once in a while in a planning worksheet, you'll see something that doesn't make sense, and it's because it's using the default overflow level. And you can see how that overflow level is calculated for fixed reorder quantity, reorder point, minimum plus rounded to nearest order multiple. And you really don't want that when you're first getting into planning, or maybe ever. I don't know. I'm a fan of once you understand what that field uses or how it works, you control it with that parameter on the item. Next slide. We're still on, we talk about time buckets. That's another field that applies to fixed reorder. And this is a key field to solve that puzzle of why is it telling me, for those of you running the planning worksheet, or for that rec worksheet for that matter, why is it telling me to add a new PO and cancel one that's 2 days later? This time bucket can help with that puzzle. And I see it in safety stock. So for instance, if you have a safety stock, it creates an emergency order, and I create a PO for it. That's going to come in 2 weeks. And tomorrow I run planning and I got another emergency order. You've probably seen that. And the way to manage that noise in the planning worksheet is to use this time bucket. And in that case I described, I might look out 21 days. Yes, I know I'm below the safety stock, but it'll keep pulling from safety stock. Now, should you get down to 0, you will get a planning message. But if you never get down to 0 and you've got your time bucket set up correctly, you're good to go. Because you're, as a buyer, I know I'm going to get it in 2 weeks. I don't think we're going to eat up all that safety stock. So I don't want that noise in the planning worksheet. So a time bucket can be a nice tool to cut down on some of the noise in your planning worksheet, worksheet. Okay, next slide. We're going to talk about a second maximum reorder quantity. Works much like fixed reorder. Have a reorder point, but I have a maximum quantity instead. So when I get to the order equal to or less than the reorder point, it's going to recommend order up to the maximum. So in my example here, I've got 100. If I had 95 in inventory or the based on activity, I'd get below 100. It would tell me to order, if I had 95, 205 to get back up to the 300. I see this reorder policy used in companies that manage remote inventory, where you always want to maintain a level. It might be used for subcontractors where you supply material and you always want to maintain a level of so many of this and so many of this and so many of this, and you set up a maximum. on that, and then the replenishment is to either buy or transfer into that location to get back up the maximum quantity. So that's a quick overview of Maxim. Next slide, Angie. And let's see, we'll go to lot for lot. This is a good reorder policy for B and A items, the more expensive items. This one is basically used, it will, when there's demand, tell me about it. Now, the got you there, of course, is your lead time. But that's where the safety stock on lot for lot would serve you well, potentially. And safety stock, if I define that for you, and I think you know this already, a lot of you, it's the your on-hand quantity that you want within the lead time. In other words, you're trying to not run out within the lead time based on activity. But lot for lot is a good choice for that. The lot accumulation is important when you're using lot for lot because you want to combine orders potentially. Lot for lot is good for, I think, for finished items in production. Those that aren't you know, it's just a good option for the more expensive items. Next slide. And then the last one is order. This one is truly unique because you can. It doesn't look at inventory. I could set up an item and it's always order. Goes to the planning worksheet. I could have 100 on the shelf, have a sales order for 10, and it would tell me that I need to make 10. When you do carry out the action message from the planning worksheet, it will create a reservation, a hard reservation. This is another way to get the order linked to the sales order, if that's truly how you run your business and you don't have on hand. The other, which some of you are probably using, is you can create the firm plan production order right off the sales order, which also creates a reservation. But this reorder policy allows you to take that away from the CSR and customer service rep and put it into the planner's hands when you get to that point. One other mention is I forgot to mention, a lot for lot, you can turn off inventory on an item there, which may have I did have a customer who created blending material, and that blend was good for 1 day, so they didn't want it to look at inventory in planning. Basically, tell me I've got to make it and don't look at remaining on hand. So there are some functionality there that you could use. Next slide. Okay. And then to wrap up, make to stock, here's some gaps that you probably know about if you're using production for items that you put on, you make sub-assemblies even. Byproducts you have to determine how you're going to track byproducts. You can add byproducts to the manufactured order, but you don't want it to do the math. For instance, if I have a byproduct, I don't want it to multiply by 1,000 because my run is for 1,000. So there's some discussion there and strategy. As we saw, the planning fields, all very critical, all very important to purchasing and production, but they're not dynamic. In other words, I can't hit a button and recalculate based on a last 3-month activity or 6 months, those kind of things. So as a planning group, you have to have a strategy of how often do we update those dynamic planning fields. And BC and NAV do now bring to the table the rapid start, which allows you to export these planning fields, update them in a spreadsheet and pull them back in, which is a nice feature. But much like standard cost strategy, how often are you going to do this? Becomes more critical if you have seasonality. Obviously, you want, let's say that you're in the spring, we had a seed company, they sell seed in the spring, but they need to ramp up harvesting in the southern states in much sooner, like October, November, December, to get things ramped up. So your planning fields have to reflect if you have seasonality or trends, obviously. Forecasting, you obviously can use even a component forecast, not a sales forecast. It's manual. So you develop it in a spreadsheet, you can pull it in with Rapid Start again. So lots of tools there. And gaps in the manufacturing side, how do you manage tools, dies, molds, constraints on, I was in one company, they broke down chemicals, solids, and they'd use furnaces, but they only had one power supply. So I couldn't schedule off by furnaces because they only had one power supply. So how do you do things like that? So that's the make to stock. So again, if you got any questions, please put them in the IM and Angie will jump on it and we'll try and answer your questions. Okay, next slide. We're going to go with make to order, build to order. You might have a configurator. When the order is taken, you're filling in some parameters. It might be how long a cable is, how long the we worked with a bow company and they had a configurator, you know, the string color, the riser length, all those kind of things about a bow were custom, and they configured it as they took the order. And it might be multiple production orders to create something like this. So we might have for the riser a production order, for the limbs a production order, for the string to make the string. All those kind of things could happen. So next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about make to order, build to order, some of the functionality. Routing types, lot size come into play, and it crosses more of the manufacturing types. We'll get into that. There's something to help us with purchasing, bill of material, lead time offset. Material rounding is important on the bills, and constraint schedule. So we'll talk about those in this section. So next slide. Okay, so routing types. Obviously, there's serial. Serial simply means when the first operation done, we go to the second operation, we go to the third operation. The piece in serial we can leverage is there's a send ahead quantity. Maybe you fill a pallet. When that pallet is done, you move it to the next operation, which can help scheduling. And as I don't wait for all 1,000 parts to be cut at operation 10. After 250 are done, I can start the next operation. And we have parallel operations. So we'll take an example, we'll show that. So next slide. Okay, so here's a serial operation, very simple. Couple pointers I'm a fan of. Work centers, always in hours. I, as a planner, want to look at my load. How many hours on a 8-hour shift, for instance, or 8-hour day do I have consumed? I'd like to see, 7.2 hours versus, 438 minutes. So if you have an option, if your standards allow it in your route, I would go with hours. Now you can have the work center in hours and build the routing in minutes, but I'll show you how you can do that without that kind of effort. So this is just an example. We've got setup time, run time. Lot size is the piece that can help me immensely if I have an option to set up my routings. Just recently, as this example shows, I've set 1 hour. So this operation 10, the wheel assembly in 1 hour, I need. Now it's not per piece, it's the lot size. So I can do 5 an hour. I had one company we worked with, and they were doing it by shift. So in 8 hours, they had a lot size of 300. So I think it's very simple to use. If you have an option, please take a look at it. Lot size can be your friend. I like it because it's very visual when someone looks at a routing. Well, how do we come up with the standard? And this one I'd look at and I'd say, well, we can do 5 an hour. And somebody might say, well, that's not right. It should have been 50. Where if you've got per minute, it takes 0.01356 per one, that doesn't mean a whole lot to me. Yes, somebody came up with that calculation, but don't forget lot size. Now, of interest, it's not exposed on the routing by default, which is you have to add it to the view. But take a look at it. It's a nice function of BC/nav that is underutilized. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to talk about parallel. What is parallel? That simply means I do two operations at the same time. Now, how could you use that? If your either standard cost rollup or your costing typically is done offline, and a lot of reasons for that, but nav does allow you to do a lot of nice things to bring costing into nav. This example here, I've got two operations at the same time. One is the machine, so I need so much time to run the machine where I could have my overhead, and the second is how much labor do I need. An example of that is I got a machine that's running 8 hours, but I might only need 2 hours of labor on it because the person's maybe I don't need them to watch the machine. So there is a way to get that kind of functionality into your routing, and it's called parallel. There are some tips with that. Obviously, you don't want your labor to be a constraint. You want the machine because the first operation you list should be your primary constraint. You're trying to manage the machine time, the work in that work center, not so much the people. But for one customer, we set up the machine, and then we need a setup man, setup person, I should say, in this today, right? And for 1 hour, and then we need three people to run the machine for the next 4 hours. You can do that, and that could be reflected in your cost rollup. And when I talk about cost rollup, you can do a cost rollup with FIFO. I don't know if many of you know that. You can actually do a cost rollup even if you are a FIFO coster. You don't have to be a standard. Next slide, and we'll get to things to use. Lot size I talked about, terrific tool. Flushing method. Nav does allow you to simply back flush material or labor based on activity that you do. I'm a big fan of leveraging that where it makes sense. That's kind of a lean approach. Oftentimes we'll set it up where the material is back flushed based on posting output. So as if the job's on the floor for 3 days, I am getting those dollars, particularly at month end. We have some work in process dollars that are part of our ledger for month end. So flushing would help me consume that material automatically. Obviously, if you have lot numbers or serial numbers, there's ways to do that and still do automatic flushing. And then the process, you just have to support, they used an extra one of a component. How do I do that? You can do that even with flushing methods. Set to back flush. Forward flush typically is a recipe type where you input the material and the output is never consistent. Concurrent capacities. This is a good example. Is I have a labor grade in my I need labor grade 9 in my routing. It's parallel routing, and I need 3 of those resources. So nav would actually figure out how many hours I would need, times 3. So that's a good use for concurrent capacities. Another is I have 3 CNC machines. Best example is I had a company that had 5 CNC machines. I got a job, let's say it took 40 hours. I could run it on one machine and it would take all week, or I could run it on all 5 by saying concurrent capacities is 5. It would schedule all 5 of the CNC machines, and I can get it done in 1 day. So concurrent capacities allows you for the planner to manage how many of these machines or am I going to use on this production order. The one thing to remember, if I use concurrent capacities and I have setup, it will charge 2 setups, 3, 4, 5. In my example, we'd have 5 setups, which then, of course, when you're analyzing the production order, it took longer than expected or more dollars. But why? Because the planner scheduled it on 5 because of the rush order and those kind of things. But it all works well. Send ahead, we talked about. Routing link code, kind of an interesting name, but all it is saying my components in the bill of material are linked to this operation. So when I report output on that operation, I'm going to potentially backflush based on they posted 5 output. I would backflush components 5 times. That works fine. Versions, yes, Nav has routing versions. Don't see a lot of use for that. I do see use for alternate routings, I'll call them, where I have 3 different lines I'm scheduling. Maybe my routing calls out line 1 as the default. But if we get super busy, I as a planner could move it to line 2, and it might have different routing standards. And you can do that as a planner. You can assign a different routing for this release production order. I'm going to run it on line 2. And I would, see that load and all that good stuff as a planner. Next slide. Kind of watching my time here to try and get through. Okay. Bill of materials. I did mention the lead time offset. This is one technique. If I want all my material to be in this example, 2 days before I start the production order, I would want to fill this in my bill of material. So my production order was scheduled to start on 8/31. It would tell me my due date for purchasing is 2 days before that, 8/29. I would say selectively use it. Maybe you're ordering something that needs to be QA for a couple days. This is one technique you could do. On your bill of material for that motor, let's say that you got a QA process or you got to test it, or some QA process. You could put 2 days, 3 days, and that would give the buyer those buffer days. It would say, I need to get it here on the 28th, but production's not starting until the 31st. Okay, Angie, next slide, please. And let's see, we've got rounding precision. I'm sure people have worked with this. Typically, your prod order items are 1. You don't have fractions of prod orders unless maybe it's a batch. So just be aware of that. This is the rounding it does based on for the planning worksheet. So if you got 2 decimals, 3 decimals, if I left it at 1 and it was a component, let's say we'd use 0.5 of a gallon on something, when planning ran, it would say I need 1 gallon. So rounding precision comes into play when you start running the requisition and planning worksheet. Okay, next slide. Okay. Constraint scheduling, we'll talk a lot about. NAV does have it. It's a different mentality. It's forward scheduling versus backward. NAV by default, everything. Planning worksheet, refreshing production orders. The default is backward. So based on the due date and other parameters I set up, it calculates backwards and gives me a start date. That's a great way to get started, no pun intended. Understand what it does there, understand how it's infinitely loading and how to manage it. Constraint scheduling can work. It's kind of the theory of constraints in my mind. If you have 1, 2 particular areas that are a bottleneck, you possibly could work with constraint scheduling to look at the impact, how it might work. So I'll leave it at that. We don't have a lot of people doing that. There used to be a product called Planner One that was forward scheduling, but that product is not being brought forward to BC, so that's not an option, but there are others. Okay, we'll keep going here. Manufacturing policy. My only comment here is it's not as intuitive as you might think. You might say, well, I always make this to order. I never make it to stock. but in reality, it's how it's building that production order. If your production order needs both items on one production order, which NAV can do, both items would be make to order. If the first item and the second should be on two separate orders, the top level could be make to order. That's maybe valid. But the next subassembly make to stock, even though you don't, it gives you two production orders. And I've seen companies go both ways. So just be aware it's not quite as intuitive as you might think. It's how it builds the production order. And an example below, all three of those were make to order. So it built one production order with all three line items on, and it does time phase. So you see that the end date is before the one above, and etc. And each line will have their own bill and route. For some companies, this does work. For others, it's not so much. Okay, next slide. Okay, again, some gaps. Make to order, byproducts, planning we talked about, dynamic. And the only constraint we have in NAV or BC is time. So if you have a tool constraint that this can be used on two jobs, you're not missing a setup to say, well, for this tool, I want to treat this like time. I can't run this job at the same time as this one. So oftentimes we take a look at your process. I've had some companies put the tool in the route name. Just some common sense things. It's not perfect, but just be aware we have one constraint to manage, and that's time. Next slide. Okay. Process. I'll go through this pretty quick, I think. I'm going to call process, you've got recipes, chemicals, formulas, typically compressed lead times, shelf life constraints. You might even be doing FIFO, first expired, first out, lot tracking. So let's next slide. So some of the process key things we could use. The bill of material has a unit of measure, and there are families in NAV. I don't know if you haven't looked at it, there's production families. Limited use, but we'll take a look at it. Next slide. So the bill of material, unit of measure. You can set up your bill of material with a unique unit of measure. Working with one company recently where they run their product in different size gallon processes. Might be a 3,000 gallon, 1,500. And the issue was the components, they didn't want to have rounding issues, because if you put this in there per 1 gallon, you create a production order, it's going to do the math, and you're going to see some of those things. So they set up multiple units or multiple bills of materials for the same item, but the differentiator is the size of the run. You can do that. You just have to set up on the item that a gallon 3,000 unit of measure is 3,000 gallons on the item. Pretty simple to do. Another use I had was I had a gold and silver customer who wanted 7 decimal points. Well, as you know, NAV out of the box is 5, although I think there's 27 in the background. But to modify or customize all that, it's not really an option. But we were able to say, let's create your bill of materials per 100, which gave us, in reality, 2 more decimal spots. Because they never ran one of a component, they ran like 1,000, 10,000, and that allowed us to do the math and get really precise costing on expensive gold and silver components without a modification. Okay, next slide. Okay, here's an example of a bill of material that's in a case. So all the components are how many fit in the case. It's not per pound, for instance. That would allow me on a production order to, I want to make 100 cases, even though my inventory unit measures pounds. Next slide. Families I'll touch on a little bit. I have had used this in the food where a mix was made. There's a salad mix, and the production order was packaged in 1 pound containers, 2 pound containers, and cases and pails. And NAV does allow you to do that. You can set up a family. The one consistency you have to have it as they all use the same routing. Not for everybody, but it's there. It's an option potentially use, and more in the packaging. I'll call it of a blend or a mix. Next slide, please. And here's a example of a family again. We're making cases, pails, etc. Next slide. Process gaps that we have, the ones we talked about already. Scrap is of interest. I think you lose some processes lose in the pipe, in the piping, and the vessel. You mix something and maybe it's more of a solid mix, and when you package it, you have leftovers. So how do you apply the remaining scrap? Because the batch is done. You can't salvage that, but you need to apply it against the cost of the the family order items that we just did. So that's one thing. The other is I recently have had process who track overhead in pounds. It was pounds, but the product is like a shape. There's one shape, but it weighs 1,200 pounds, which is adding all the components together. And overhead was developed years ago on pounds. So we were able to handle that in NAV. It was of interest, but it took a little bit, but we got that without a modification. Next slide. Okay. Assemble to order profile. This one is somebody who buys everything, has it outsourced, and brings it in and assembles it. So my definition is purchase all the components. Not much fabbing in you don't do any fabbing probably. You just put things together. We have some customers that that's what they do. Medium long-term bills, multiple production orders, issues difficult to measure. Hey, are we on track or not? Launching production orders throughout, and have long lead time items. Next slide. We'll just talk a little bit about some of the assemble. Might be using machines with work centers and assigning work. How do we manage progress on these? Alternate routings and bills potentially, and possibly using phantoms, just how we might use those. Next slide. Okay, I'm going to describe this. I won't necessarily, I think we're going to flip through slides quickly, but you can, as you would expect, I have a routing for a work center. I don't know which machine, if I've got 3 machines or lines all capable of doing the work, I don't know which one I'm going to assign it to up front. So my routing is assigning it to a work center. In BC NAV, the planner then has this firm planned order, and let's say today is Tuesday, and I'm scheduling work for next Monday or Friday. I'm looking at loads on the different lines like I got here. But my work center is where it's assigned to the work center because, again, we don't know which machine we're going to use. I have the ability to then take that and move it to a machine, and it'll update the routing or the production order correctly. And now when I look at the load on the machine, I've just moved that work from a generic work center, which is fine because I need to know how many hours I've got, and then I move it to the machine. So next slide, and we're just going to flip through this because next slide, just be aware that it can do that. Next slide. Okay, progress on work, let's talk about. So and this is probably all production orders. How do I know where I'm at? I'll give a little plug for Insight Works. They have a shop floor data collection. piece that's kind of nice. They have some fields that as people clock in and out, it has a soft post to production, I'll call it. So you can see how far I am through the routing. But out of the box, again, without any add-ons, we have a routing status. So it goes in as planned. As soon as anything's recorded on it, it's in progress. And then if you need this, you can have each operation marked finished. So if I went into this, I could see, oh, we've got 4 operations. We're at operation 3 because the first 2 are finished. That's about the best progress report we can do. And of course, the key one is the last one. You've got the, when production orders are ran, when can I change the status to finished, the overall production order, which takes if you're posting expected costs, it does the WIP number, pushes it to inventory or cost of goods sold, runs the layered value for the components, all that stuff happens. But how do I know when to do that? And my suggestion is we have a queue that we put on the who's ever going to finish production orders, which shows you any production order where the last operation is marked finished. And that is driven back to the floor where, oh, well, I'm done with the production order, and the lead person or somebody takes a cursory look at the production order. Hey, did we issue all the components? Did we record labor for doing that? If that looks good, I'm going to complete that last operation because I've done my, maybe I've posted labor for running the inside product or whatever. I mark it finished, which is the trigger to someone to actually finish the production order. So that's probably the simplest control that I can recommend. Next production order, or next screen, not production order. Alternate routing simply are that. We can run this several different ways. I've got a primary that sits on the item card. The item record has the default routing. But as a planner, I'm looking at the load in that area. I've got my firm planned order, and I can actually override the routing number. That happens a lot, and I see people doing, but not so much the production bomb. You could override that too if you wanted to. And this is where you would do it. And then next slide, I think the refresh screen is showing. Next one. Maybe not. I'll talk about the refresh screen is where you control using what you've updated on the production order. Unmark the lines and just refresh it using a bill and route from the production order, not going back to the item record. So just okay. Here's the phantom. It's simply called a production bomb. I'll call it a phantom. I create a bill of material, and maybe it's for packaging material. So I need banding, strapping, pallet, label, all that sitting in one bill of material, not assigned to any item. It's just a packaging bill of material. Now on my bill of material for the finished item, I can call it a production bomb, pull that, reference it here. It doesn't pull the lines in. When I create the production order, it pulls the line in, and this phantom number goes away. So that allows me to have good maintenance, simple maintenance. Let's say I have even 25 parts that share the same packaging bill of material. If I have an update to that packaging bill of material, we got a new label or something, I can change it in one spot and impact 25 different finished orders. Okay, next slide. Some will order gaps. I'm just going to pick refreshing production orders might be a problem, as you probably know, those of you running manufacturing. If I have any activity, capacity ledger entries, item ledger entries, I cannot refresh a bill of material. So changes in assembly to order, not as significant as engineer to order, but our capital equipment, but it can be. So then what would I have to do? I'd have to manually go in and update them. That's a gap to be aware of. Next slide. Okay, this is the last one. Try and go through this quickly, time for questions. Okay, typically long build time items. I worked with a company that made paper converting equipment. That machine was on the floor for 9 months. 2,000 production orders. That's an extreme, but yes, been through that puzzle. Multiple production orders. Again, how do you know you're done? How do you know you're on track on a 9 months order? We'll talk about that in a minute. You're launching production orders throughout. In other words, I can launch the mechanical right away orders, but electrical, maybe they're deciding on Johnson Controls or GE or whatever. That's not decided yet. So I need to launch. I can't wait till every drawing is done. Even if you only had like 400 drawings or 300 or even 30, you can't wait. You have to start. You have to machine the material. That whole thing. Get to and let purchasing know they got to order it as soon as you can. And you got potentially longer lead times. Next slide, Angie. Jobs might be a solution here. I know it's underutilized module in nav, but how would I use jobs? I would have, let's say I've got 25 production orders to make this machine or whatever I'm making. I might recap all those in jobs. So I've got a kind of a total in jobs of all 25 production orders plus, jobs can do the, I guess it costs the hidden costs, like maybe you had to fly out for a meeting and you want to charge it on there, those kind of things for analysis. So jobs might be a friend of capital equipment because you can push items from jobs into the planning worksheet. So I can get those 25 modules I need into the planning worksheet to let me know I need to create production orders and this and that. Okay, we'll keep going in an effort to leave a little bit. So again, jobs, keep going. Next one, Angie. Again, it's got task lines. Not great at scheduling, but we can put gross hours in and that kind of thing. Next line, or next screen. We're gonna flip through jobs here. This is an example of putting time. Replanning is a potential something underutilized. Obviously, the planning worksheet will do this, but what this does is I put in my top level item, and if it's got sub-assemblies that are make to stock, because what does make to order do? I might put it on the same order, make to stock. If I go to replan and do all levels, it will generate those additional production orders if I don't have inventory. So it's kind of a manual way to link those orders together. And there's a column that is the origin of this production order, and I could see, oh yeah, it's driven from the replan reference numbers would all be the same, like in this example. I put in the top level item, hit the replan, and it generated 2 more because we didn't have inventory for those sub-assemblies. Next screen. Gaps. Probably the biggest one is this refresh. Because in my example, I had mechanical parts all released, and I want to add electrical. Well, they've probably started the fabbing and all that on the mechanical, and I can't just add those electrical. So that's just something to discuss and what are our options. And then how best to complete time, how are we doing on schedule now? With it, and this is an extreme, with 2,000 drawings, how do I know I'm on schedule? And we landed on a, it sounds kind of strange, but again, you don't have to always have hours be your measurement. It was how many drawings we got done each day. To know whether we had a good day or bad day. I'm trying to think, there used to be a John Costanza, I think, who was a consultant running around, and he would look at your output each day. How do you measure a good day or a bad day? And a lot of it was not on quantity or dollars, because another one, they made backhoe buckets. But if I made a giant one, that was worth like 25 points versus 3 small ones, which were worth 5 points a piece. And they had a measurement of, they wanted, I think this is right, like 75 points a day for output. So they would have a different way to look at how do you know you had a good day or a bad day kind of thing. Next slide. think we're getting. I think I'm going to cut it off here. I only really have left a couple things, but if we go to the end, we can flip through this. Our sample workflow for planner. Keep going. Keep going. Due date is our key date in NAV, obviously BC. Keep going. You can change the routing and bill in the planning worksheet if you didn't know that. Keep going. There's a planning flexibility flag that allows you to tell the system to ignore, to kind of cut down on the noise, but you have to get the rest under control before you kind of start using some of those advanced. So I'm going to leave it up for questions. I know we went through a lot, no pun intended, with lots, but any questions? I want to leave a few minutes here.
Thank you, John, for the presentation. No questions have come through, but if anyone does have any that you would like John to address, please go ahead and get those typed in.
And my last comment is not, again, keep in mind, every manufacturing company runs NAV a little bit different. So it's what's important to you. Because as implementers, our goal is not to set up and use every function within this product. I'm not a fan of customizations. I've broken those into two things with the way things have gone: is must have and nice to have. So keep that in mind when, if it's a must have, yes, we certainly, what are our options? Nice to have might go on a list and stay on a list.
All right, John, thank you again. No questions have come through, so I guess that means that you nailed it. So,
shoot, I was going to give $25 to the first person who asked a question.
Oh. All right, thank you everyone for attending. We appreciate your patience with the technical difficulty that we had at the beginning. I just want to thank everyone who's watching on demand. Thank you for joining us. And we do have a couple of webinars coming up soon. Next week we have Alan Wine from Innovia Consulting. He's going to be presenting on building Power BI for operations. And then on August 1st, can you believe it's going to be August already? We have Mark Kane from Innovia Consulting, and he's going to be presenting on navigating Business Central. So if you're interested in any of those webinars or any of our future webinars, please go to our website and register under events and check out all the different ones that we have upcoming. And we do have our podcast going on. If you haven't heard of it yet, it's the Innovia Conversation. Check that out on our podcast page. And then Innovia is a proud sponsor of Summit. This year it's going to be in Orlando, Florida. So if you haven't already registered, or if you want to know more about Summit, go to our conference page to learn more about that, or you can talk to your account rep for questions on Summit. All right, thank you again, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you again soon on another Innovia webinar. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.